I used to believe love meant sacrifice, so I sacrificed everything. My dreams, my friends, even my health to support Chadwick. He was my husband, my world, the man I believed would rise and take me with him. I handled the bills, managed the household, cooked every meal, and stayed quiet when he came home late smelling of perfume I didn't wear. "She's just an assistant," he said when I asked about Krista, the young woman always hovering around him. I trusted him, told myself I was overthinking, but the doubts festered in silence. One rainy night, he came home cold and distant. "Don't wait up tonight," he muttered, grabbing a fresh shirt. I didn't sleep. Hours later, police knocked on our door. They arrested me on charges of embezzlement from Chadwick's company. I was stunned, unable to speak as they dragged me out in handcuffs. My husband didn't protest. He didn't even look me in the eye. At the station, Krista smiled triumphantly as she gave her statement. I kept thinking, this has to be a mistake. Chadwick would clear this up, but he never came. And that was the night I died. Not physically, but in every other way. I spent the first week in jail curled in a ball on a thin mattress, replaying everything. I combed through every interaction, every moment I missed, every smile that was fake, and every lie I swallowed to protect our marriage. I had nothing, not even a toothbrush of my own. They'd taken my dignity, my privacy, and worst of all, my belief that someone who claimed to love me ever meant it. Chadwick didn't visit. He didn't send a lawyer. Krista had built a case against me so cruelly accurate that even I started questioning if I had slipped somewhere. Maybe I had. Maybe I signed something unknowingly. My hands shook as I remembered the company forms Chadwick used to hand me, saying, "Just sign this, babe." I was naive. I believed we were a team, but now I was alone, just another inmate with swollen eyes and a trembling voice. One guard gave me a torn notebook and a half-used pen. "Might help," she said, so I started writing. At first, it was just angry rambling, but then memories poured out, and the more I wrote, the more I saw clearly I was framed, and they wanted me erased. The other women in jail didn't ask questions. Not at first. Most of them had their own demons to wrestle with, but eventually a few started talking to me, sharing bits and pieces of their stories in hushed tones over gray trays of watery soup. One of them, Lena, had been betrayed by her own sister. Another had been locked up for covering for her boyfriend. I realized I wasn't unique in pain. I was just new to it, but slowly I started listening, learning. They weren't just criminals. They were women whose trust had been used like a weapon. I began reading legal books from the tiny library, trying to understand my own case. What did the paperwork say? What exactly had I been accused of? The more I dug, the more obvious it became. Krista's testimony was fabricated. She quoted conversations that never happened. Transactions I never authorized were signed in handwriting I didn't recognize. I began filing notes, building timelines. If no one else was going to save me, then I had to do it myself. That's when something shifted inside me. I no longer wanted Chadwick to come for me. I wanted to face him in court and win. 6 months passed before my first real breakthrough. A junior attorney named Melinda, volunteering for a legal outreach program, reviewed my file and raised an eyebrow. "You were railroaded," she said bluntly. She saw what I had. Inconsistencies, gaps, sloppy forgeries. Her firm agreed to represent me pro bono. That night, I wrote 10 pages in my notebook, not about pain, but about possibility. I could feel it, a faint crack in the concrete cell I built around my hope. I remembered how much I used to love writing. Before I got too busy being Chadwick's shadow, I used to dream of publishing, of using words to reach people. Somewhere along the line, I gave that up. Now, as I sat in that freezing, echoing cell, I decided to start again. My first real story would be mine. Not the one Chadwick told the world. Not the version Krista painted with her lies. My truth, from my voice. A rebirth. When I finally got a court date, I didn't panic. I prepared. I wasn't going to cry on the stand. I was going to reclaim my name. And I was going to watch Chadwick's carefully built world crack. Court day arrived like a storm. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from focus. I wore the plainest clothes they'd give me, hair tied back, no makeup, no frills, just truth. Krista didn't show up. Apparently, she'd fled to another state after being questioned about falsifying evidence in another unrelated case. Cowardice in heels. My lawyer dismantled the prosecution's argument piece by piece. Forged documents. Phantom conversations. Inconsistencies in dates. I watched as the judge's expression shifted from bored to baffled. Chadwick sat a few rows back, perfectly polished in his navy suit, looking everywhere but at me. When they read the words "case dismissed," I didn't cry. I stood up straight, nodded once, and walked out without a backward glance. Reporters hounded the exit. Chadwick called after me. "Let's talk. Just you and me?" he said. I walked past him, like he was a stranger asking for spare change. Because that's what he was now. Nothing. I left the courthouse alone, but free. I'd lost years, my reputation, my home, but I'd regained something far more valuable, my self-respect. And I had no plans of ever giving it up again. Starting over wasn't glamorous. I moved in with my sister, who lived 3 towns away in a modest apartment above a flower shop. She cried when she saw me, pulled me into her arms, and said, "I never believed them, not for 1 second." That broke me in a way the jail never could. I sobbed into her shoulder, letting the months of survival drain out. With her help, I got a part-time job at a small bookstore cafe. The owner didn't ask about my past, just said, "Everyone deserves a soft place to land." I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror at first. Hair thinner, face sharper, eyes older. But beneath it all, there was a flicker of strength, of clarity, of something coming alive again. I started writing again during my lunch breaks. Short stories, little poems, a character here, a phrase there. The pen felt foreign at first, but then it felt like home. I didn't post on social media. I didn't chase Chadwick or look up Krista. I simply lived, day by day, cup by cup, word by word. And that's when it truly began. Not just survival, but healing. I was free, and I would stay that way. One rainy afternoon, a man named Ellis walked into the bookstore. Tall, quiet, with kind eyes and paint on his hands. He was an artist who ran weekend workshops for children and had lost his wife to cancer 2 years before. We talked about books at first, nothing deep, nothing demanding, just pages and preferences. But something about his presence didn't push or pull. It just existed alongside mine. And that felt safe. I told him, eventually, in pieces, what had happened to me. He didn't flinch or pity me. He just listened. "What they did to you," he said, "isn't who you are. Who you are is who got through it." Those words stayed with me. For the first time, I didn't define myself by the betrayal or the cell. I defined myself by what came after. I submitted a short story anonymously to a local journal. When it was published, I didn't tell anyone. I just clipped it out and tucked it in my journal, a little badge of rebirth. Chadwick was still out there. His business was struggling. His face occasionally popped up in tabloids next to Krista's scandals. But I didn't care. My story wasn't his anymore. Word spread quietly about my writing. A teacher from the community college came into the shop one day and said, "You should apply to the adult writing program." I almost laughed, me back in school, but I did it, and I got in. Evening classes filled my days with a new rhythm. Homework, critiques, nervous readings in front of strangers who clapped anyway. I started to feel the weight I'd carried, Chadwick's manipulation, the shame, the buried potential, begin to lift. Each assignment wasn't just an exercise. It was a reclamation. I wrote about a woman who lived in a glass house built by someone else, and how she finally threw the stone that shattered it all. That story got picked up by an independent publisher for a small anthology. My sister cried when I told her. I didn't cry. I just smiled quietly and thought, this is only the beginning. Ellis surprised me with a notebook bound in leather. On the first page, he'd written, "Because your voice deserves permanence." I kissed him for the first time that night, not because I needed saving, but because I had already saved myself and could finally choose, not settle. I thought I'd buried the past until Chadwick showed up outside the bookstore on a cloudy Tuesday. He looked thinner, like guilt had been chewing on him for months. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped outside, arms folded. "You have 5 minutes." He began with rehearsed remorse, words polished to sound sincere. "I made a mistake. Krista lied to me too. I was under pressure. I didn't think it would go that far." I said nothing. He scrambled. "I lost everything after you left. Clients pulled out. Investors questioned my judgment." I raised an eyebrow. "So this is about your losses, not mine." He looked stunned, like he expected tears, maybe even forgiveness. But the woman who once would have clung to his every word was gone. "I'm with someone now," I said plainly. "Someone who values me, not for what I can give, but for who I am." He nodded slowly, swallowing the rejection like poison. "I'll always regret what I did," he said. I looked him in the eye. "Good. You should." I turned and walked away, each step lighter. For the first time, I realized I didn't just survive Chadwick. I surpassed him. And that was the sweetest closure I never asked for. His regret, though, wasn't enough to change anything. As weeks passed, I saw glimpses of the man Chadwick used to be, but only through whispers and news articles. His company, once thriving, now looked like a sinking ship. Investors pulled out, citing poor decisions and internal strife. Krista had vanished from the headlines, likely as irrelevant as she'd been to his downfall. His empire, built on lies and betrayal, crumbled. Still, a part of me felt hollow when I thought about it. Not because I cared for him anymore, but because his failure was a reminder of what he'd taken from me. The life I thought I was building. My future, shattered in one moment of weakness. But that was before. Now, I had something he would never understand. Freedom. Freedom to create my own path, to choose what I wanted, to write my own story. And I wasn't going to let his ruins define me. I wouldn't let the ashes of our past hold me down any longer. I was free, but it wasn't just freedom from him. It was freedom from the woman I used to be, tied to a man who never deserved me. The day I received the offer to publish my first book was the day everything truly changed. It wasn't some big glamorous publishing deal, but it was enough. Enough to know that I had something of my own to share with the world. The journey to writing had been long and difficult. I had to crawl through the rubble of my past, sift through the wreckage, and find pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. But here I was, receiving validation for something I created on my own. No more living in the shadow of someone else's expectations. My book wasn't a memoir, though a part of it was based on my experiences. It was fiction, yes, but woven with threads of truth, truths I had tucked away for far too long. That book was the first chapter of my new life, one that didn't involve a man who never cared to see me. Chadwick's words, his lies, his manipulations, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was what I was doing now, who I was becoming. That was the real rebirth. And I had no intention of looking back. But even with all the new beginnings, the whispers of my past still found their way into my present. My phone rang one morning, and the name on the caller ID made my stomach twist. Chadwick. I almost didn't answer, but a part of me, the part that still needed closure, couldn't let it go. "Hello." I answered, my voice steady, though my hands shook. "It's me," he said, and I could almost hear the weight of the years in his voice. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to apologize. Really this time. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. The silence stretched between us like an abyss. I know you've moved on, he continued, but I need you to understand. I was wrong. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the coffee cup in front of me. Chadwick, it's too late. You took your shot, and you missed. There was a pause on the other end. As if he was processing the words, I said, I'm sorry, he repeated, this time softer. But I didn't need his apology anymore. I wasn't the woman who would beg for it. I could hear the resignation in his voice, but that didn't change anything. I didn't need his forgiveness or his closure. I had already closed that door long ago. Goodbye, Chadwick, I said, ending the call before he could say anything else. There was no more space for him in my life. No more room for his regret or his guilt. The life I was building, the life that was mine and mine alone, was so much bigger than any of the damage he had caused. I took a deep breath and looked out the window at the city bustling below. People were out there living their lives, chasing their own dreams. Some would fail, others would rise. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, owning my future. I wasn't the same woman who had cried herself to sleep in a jail cell. I wasn't the woman who once thought she had to depend on a man to define her. I was reborn, and I had no intentions of letting anything or anyone take that away from me. Chadwick's downfall was just the beginning of my own transformation. The book I published led to more opportunities, writing workshops, speaking engagements, even requests for my own advice on rebuilding life after betrayal. It was strange at first to think of myself as someone others would look to for wisdom, but I realized it wasn't just the words I spoke that resonated. It was my story, my resilience, my ability to pick up the pieces and turn them into something new, and I wasn't ashamed of it. I wore my scars like badges of honor because they were proof of how far I had come. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone, especially Chadwick. It was about proving to myself that I could survive and thrive on my own. The years I spent trapped in a relationship that stifled me were now nothing more than a distant memory. My future was unfolding, and I was ready to embrace every chapter. No more fear, no more self-doubt. I was stronger now, smarter, and more determined. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was creating something new, something better, something that was truly mine. As my new life took shape, Chadwick remained a ghost in the background, his calls and texts few and far between. He seemed to fade from my life the way a bad dream does after you wake up. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when I wondered if he had learned anything from the pain he'd caused. But those thoughts were quickly replaced by the realization that I didn't need him to learn. He didn't matter anymore. I had found my own worth. I had rebuilt myself from the ashes he left behind. I had transformed into someone who no longer needed validation from the man who once defined me. I didn't look back when I passed the places we used to go, or when I heard his name mentioned in the news. He was a shadow, a memory. The man who betrayed me had no place in the life I was creating, and that, more than anything else, was my victory. I was free, and I had everything I needed to move forward. All that remained was the road ahead, and it was all mine to walk. Chadwick's absence was almost like a relief now. The anxiety that once consumed me when he was near had faded into the background, replaced by the certainty that I was in control of my own life. There were moments, of course, when the past would resurface, but I was no longer that fragile woman who thought she needed him to complete her. My strength came from within, from the lessons I'd learned in the quiet of my own company. The world had changed for me in ways I never expected, and as I walked through it, I realized I no longer felt his weight. He was a chapter, not the story. I had stopped asking myself, what if, or wondering if I could have done things differently. The truth was, I was where I was meant to be. I didn't need Chadwick's apologies or his approval to know that. I had everything I needed to move forward, and that was more than enough. My heart was no longer tethered to him. In the years since, I would come to realize that the most freeing thing about my rebirth wasn't just my newfound independence. It was the peace I had found within myself. I didn't realize how much I'd grown until I found myself standing at the door of my new apartment, keys in hand, looking at the space that would become my sanctuary. It wasn't much, just a small, cozy place in a quiet neighborhood, but it was mine. I had worked for every inch of this life, every brick of this foundation. The first night I spent there, I sat in the middle of the living room, just breathing it all in. No more crowded spaces, no more manipulations, no more fear. It was just me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt comfortable in my own skin. The next few months passed in a blur of busy days and quiet evenings, all of which were centered around the life I was building for myself. I'd stopped waiting for validation from the people who had hurt me. I stopped caring about their opinions. I was no longer defined by what they thought of me. It was a quiet revolution, one that took place inside me, where I had always needed it the most. I met him a few months later at a writing event. Of all places, he was there to promote his own book, a memoir of sorts, one that told his side of the story. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He'd changed in ways I couldn't quite put into words. His face had lost its arrogance, replaced by an almost sorrowful expression. It wasn't pity, though. It was something deeper, something more regretful. He approached me hesitantly, as if unsure of how I'd react. I barely spared him a glance, but I saw the way he flinched at the sight of me. I'd become someone he could never reach again. "It's been a long time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling no desire to engage. "I heard your book's doing well." He didn't meet my eyes. "I'm glad for you." "Really?" I let the silence stretch. I could feel his gaze on me, waiting for some sort of acknowledgement, some sign that I cared. But I didn't. "Goodbye, Chadwick," I said simply, walking away. There was nothing left to say. It was strange, in a way, to think about how much had changed since that day I was locked away in that cell. If someone had told me then that I would one day feel this free, this confident, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I was, no longer bound by the chains of a man who'd never valued me, no longer afraid of what he might do next, or what his words might do to my sense of worth. The things I feared most had already happened, and I'd survived them. The pain had faded, leaving only scars that had grown into something beautiful. I looked back at all of it, not with regret, but with understanding. Everything I had gone through had been a lesson, and the lesson was this: I was stronger than I'd ever known. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth, not Chadwick, not anyone. I was the author of my own life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me again. It was my story to tell, and the future was a blank page, waiting for me to fill it. It was only when I stood before my reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning that the full weight of my transformation hit me. I was no longer the woman who had walked into that relationship, unsure of herself and dependent on someone else to make her whole. I was whole. I was enough. I didn't need anyone to complete me. I was the one who had healed myself, and that healing had turned into something more, into a power that radiated from within, into a confidence that no one could take away. Chadwick had once been my entire world, the person I thought would complete me. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow. He had no place in the woman I had become, the woman who had fought for herself, who had found herself in the darkness, and who had come out stronger than ever. I smiled at my reflection, proud of the woman I saw staring back at me. And in that moment, I realized I had truly been reborn. Even with all my accomplishments, there were still moments when I had to fight against the lingering traces of doubt. They weren't as frequent, but they would creep in, usually when I was alone. The silence was a breeding ground for old insecurities. But then I would remind myself of what I'd been through, of how far I'd come. I reminded myself that I had everything I needed to succeed, that I was the one who had pulled myself out of the wreckage. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a straight line from despair to happiness, but it was mine, my journey, and no one could take that from me. Chadwick's betrayal had been a catalyst, yes, but it had also been the catalyst for something beautiful. It had set me on a path I might never have taken otherwise. And though it had been painful, I had grown. I had found strength I never knew I had. And that strength had become my foundation. No one could ever take that away from me. As I sat down to write my next book, I couldn't help but think back on everything I had overcome. It felt like a lifetime ago. That girl who had cried herself to sleep in that cold cell. She felt so far away now. I was no longer haunted by her. I was no longer a prisoner of my past. I had turned it into something I could be proud of. As I typed the first words on the page, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. This wasn't just a book. It was my story. The story of a woman who had risen from the ashes, who had been reborn in ways that were unimaginable to anyone who had once known her. I knew there would be challenges ahead. Life was never that simple. But I also knew that no matter what came my way, I was ready because I had already survived the worst of it. And I would keep going one word at a time, one step at a time, until I finished the life I had started. The phone call came a few days later, but this time I didn't hesitate to answer. It was Chadwick again. But this time, the sense of annoyance that once would have gripped me was replaced by a strange calm. I didn't feel the need to react, to lash out, to fight. I had already fought those battles and won. "What is it?" I asked, my voice steady. He sounded different now, quieter, like he'd finally realized what his actions had cost him. "I just wanted to hear your voice," he said. "I know you hate me, but I still care about you." I couldn't help but laugh. "You don't get to say that anymore. You lost that privilege a long time ago." There was a long pause. I could almost hear him swallowing his pride. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I hope you can move on." I smiled softly, even though he couldn't see it. "I already have," I said, hanging up the phone. And for the first time, I truly meant it. The next few weeks felt surreal. The weight of Chadwick's call still hung in the air, but it no longer had the power to affect me the way it once would have. The anger, the hurt, it all seemed distant now. I was no longer tangled in his web of lies and manipulations. I had stepped out of the maze he had built around me, and I was free, free to live, free to breathe, free to be me. I took a long, deep breath and let the fresh air fill my lungs. The world felt lighter, brighter. As I stood at the window of my new apartment, looking out at the city below, I realized how far I had come. The woman who had once been broken was now a woman who stood tall and proud, unafraid of the future. Chadwick's betrayal had almost destroyed me, but it had also made me. It had forced me to look inside myself and find strength I never knew I had. And now, I was ready to take on whatever came next with open arms, knowing that I was capable of anything. One morning, I received a message from a publisher who had read my first book. It had been a story of survival, of resilience, of overcoming the darkest parts of my life. The response had been overwhelmingly positive. They wanted to meet with me. I was ecstatic, but I didn't allow myself to get too carried away. This wasn't just about the success. It was about proving to myself that I had a voice, that my story mattered, that I mattered. I'd spent so much of my life believing that I was invisible, that I didn't deserve to take up space. But now, everything had changed. I had carved out a place for myself in the world, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away. When the meeting finally came, I walked into the publisher's office with my head held high, my heart steady. It was a new beginning, one that was all mine. And as I sat down to talk about the next steps for my writing career, I couldn't help but smile. knowing that this was just the beginning of something even bigger. Chadwick's name had become a distant echo in my life, but there were still moments when it would rise to the surface. I would hear his name on the news, see a passing reference in an article, and, for a split second, I would wonder how he was doing. But then I would shake my head and remind myself that none of that mattered anymore. He was not my problem. I had spent too many years letting his actions dictate my emotions, and I wasn't about to fall into that trap again. There were moments when I would hear about his ongoing drama with his mistress, his failed attempts to regain control over his life, but I realized that I didn't care. I had a life to live, and I was no longer bound to the shadow of his influence. I was free, and nothing was going to take that away from me. I had found a new path, one that was mine to walk. Chadwick's mistakes were his own, and I had no obligation to carry the weight of them any longer. I had learned the most important lesson of all. I was enough. The more I focused on my career, the more I realized how much I had underestimated myself. I had spent so much of my life doubting my worth, believing that I needed someone else's approval to succeed. But now, as my writing journey unfolded, I began to see just how much power I held within myself. I didn't need anyone else's validation. I was the author of my own story. The more I wrote, the more I understood that this wasn't just about telling the world what had happened to me. It was about showing them the strength I had found in the aftermath. It was about proving to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet, that I could face whatever challenges life threw my way, without faltering. Writing became my therapy, my way of processing everything that had happened, and with every page, I could feel myself growing stronger, more confident. My book wasn't just a reflection of my past. It was a testament to the woman I had become, a woman who had reclaimed her life. I started dating again, tentatively at first. I had spent so long living in the shadow of Chadwick's betrayal that the idea of opening my heart to someone else felt like a foreign concept. But I realized that healing didn't mean closing myself off to love. It meant learning how to love myself first. So I started slow. I met people, had casual dates, but nothing ever felt quite right until I met him. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was something close. We shared a connection that was easy, natural. He didn't try to change me, didn't try to make me fit into some idea of who he wanted me to be. He accepted me for who I was, and that made all the difference. It wasn't about rushing into anything. It was about taking my time, learning to trust again, and discovering that love didn't have to be painful. I wasn't looking for perfection, just someone who could match my energy, who could respect my boundaries, and who could appreciate the woman I had become. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. Months passed, and I continued to find my footing in the world. I had grown in ways I hadn't thought possible. Each day brought new challenges, but I had learned to face them with grace and strength. I no longer saw myself as a victim of my circumstances, but as a survivor, a fighter. I had gone through hell and come out on the other side stronger than I had ever imagined. My career was thriving, my relationships were healthy, and I had found a peace within myself that I never thought I would experience. Chadwick's absence was like a distant memory, a ghost that no longer haunted me. The scars were still there, but they didn't define me. I had made peace with them. With everything that had happened, I had learned to forgive myself, to let go of the guilt and shame that had held me back for so long. I had learned that I was worthy of love, success, and happiness. And as I looked ahead to the future, I knew one thing for sure. My life was mine to create. It wasn't until I received a call from Chadwick that I realized just how much I had changed. He sounded different now, almost desperate, as if he was clinging to some last thread of hope that I might take him back. "I've made a huge mistake," he said. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't stop thinking about you. I need you back." I let his words hang in the air for a moment. The old me might have crumbled at the thought of his regret, might have rushed back to him, hoping for some form of reconciliation. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "Chadwick," I said, my voice steady, "you made your choice a long time ago, and I've made mine. I'm happy now, and I'm not going back to you. I've moved on." There was silence on the other end of the line, and I knew he didn't know how to respond. And I didn't care. I wasn't the person who needed him anymore. I had everything I needed within myself. Over time, I learned that forgiveness wasn't just for him. It was for me, too. I had to forgive myself for the mistakes I'd made, for the moments when I had let fear guide my decisions. I had to forgive myself for staying in a relationship that was toxic, for believing that I needed someone else to be whole. It wasn't easy. Forgiveness never is. But it was necessary. I couldn't move forward if I was still holding on to the past, still clinging to the pain that had once defined me. I had to let it go for my own peace. And once I did, I felt lighter. I felt free. It wasn't about excusing the things that Chadwick had done to me. It was about letting go of the power they still had over me. And in that release, I found strength. I found peace. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly whole. My past had shaped me, but it would never control me again. As I moved forward, I began to see the world with new eyes. Every day felt like a fresh start, an opportunity to chase after the life I had always dreamed of. I took trips to places I had always wanted to visit, started new hobbies, and surrounded myself with people who brought out the best in me. My circle was small, but it was full of genuine, kind-hearted individuals who understood my journey and respected my boundaries. I had learned to create the kind of relationships that nurtured my soul rather than drained it. The people I surrounded myself with weren't just friends. They were allies, supporters, and people who made me feel safe. I no longer had to hide parts of myself or pretend to be someone I wasn't. I had nothing to prove to anyone but myself. And as I looked around at the life I had built, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Everything I had gone through had led me here to a place of peace and self-love. It was a place I never thought I would reach, but now that I was here, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. In the months that followed, I found that I was becoming more comfortable in my own skin. I was no longer afraid of being alone because I had discovered that I was more than enough just as I was. I no longer measured my worth by the relationships I had or the approval I received from others. I knew that I was valuable not because of anyone else's perception of me, but because I had learned to value myself. I started to take better care of my body, my mind, and my soul. I practiced mindfulness, yoga, and journaling, all things that helped me reconnect with myself on a deeper level. I didn't need external validation anymore. I had found my own source of inner peace. And with that peace came a confidence I hadn't known before. I wasn't afraid to speak my truth, to stand up for what I believed in, and to chase after my goals with everything I had. The woman who had once been broken and unsure was now a force to be reckoned with. And I wasn't going to let anything or anyone take that from me. One evening, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the city below. The skyline was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, and I felt a sense of tranquility wash over me. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, I had been trapped in a life that felt like a never-ending nightmare. But here I was, sitting in peace, knowing that I had survived, I had thrived, and I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a message from someone I hadn't heard from in a while. Chadwick. My heart didn't race when I saw his name. There was no rush of anger or anxiety. I had moved past him, and his presence no longer held any power over me. His message was apologetic, filled with regret, but I wasn't interested in what he had to say anymore. I knew who I was now, and that was all that mattered. I deleted the message without a second thought, and I felt lighter for it. I had truly moved on. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I found myself looking ahead with hope, not fear. For so long, I had been living in the shadow of my past, afraid of what might happen if I let go. But now, I was embracing the future with open arms. I no longer felt the need to carry the weight of my past mistakes or the pain of betrayal. I had learned that those things didn't define me. I was the one who got to decide who I was and what my future would look like. I had taken the power back from the people and circumstances that had tried to break me. I had learned that I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was whole just as I was. And with that realization came a deep sense of freedom. I could do anything. I could be anyone. The world was mine to explore. And I was no longer held back by fear or doubt. The possibilities were endless, and I was ready to take them on. The journey wasn't always easy, but it was worth every step. There were days when I doubted myself, when the old feelings of insecurity crept back in, but I knew how to deal with them now. I had learned that it was okay to have bad days, to feel down sometimes, but I didn't have to let those feelings control me. I could acknowledge them, and then let them go. The tools I had developed over the past year, mindfulness, self-compassion, and resilience, had become my foundation. They had helped me stay grounded in moments of uncertainty, and they had helped me push forward when I wanted to give up. I wasn't the same person I had been when I was with Chadwick. I was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. I had fought hard to get here, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone take away the peace I had worked so hard to build. I had learned that I was the master of my own destiny, and I wasn't afraid to take charge of my future. By the time I finished my second book, I felt like I had truly found my purpose. Writing had become more than just a career for me. It had become a way of healing, a way of sharing my story with the world. My first book had been a cathartic release, but this one was different. It was a reflection of the woman I had become. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving. It was about living life on my own terms and embracing the beauty in every moment. I poured my heart into every page. And when the final draft was completed, I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt before. This book was more than just words on paper. It was my legacy. It was a testament to the strength and resilience that had carried me through the darkest days of my life. And as I prepared to share it with the world, I knew that I was no longer afraid. I was ready. One day, I received an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment conference. It was an honor, one I never expected, but it felt like the culmination of everything I had worked for. To be asked to share my story with others, to inspire them, was something I had never imagined. But as I read the invitation, I realized that I was ready. I had walked this path of healing and self-discovery, and now it was time to help others do the same. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. The day of the conference, I stood before a room full of women who had their own stories of struggle, of pain, and of survival. As I shared my journey with them, I saw their faces light up with recognition. They saw themselves in my story, and I saw the power of shared experience. It was a powerful moment, one that reaffirmed my purpose. I wasn't just healing for myself anymore. I was healing for all the women who needed to hear that they were not alone. As the conference came to a close, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I had helped others find their strength, just as I had found mine. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a leader, a mentor, someone who could guide others on their own paths to healing. The thought of helping others was humbling, and I realized that this was my true calling. It wasn't just about writing books or getting recognition. It was about making a difference in the lives of others, about giving them the tools and the encouragement they needed to reclaim their power. And in doing so, I was reclaiming my own. The woman who had once been a victim was now a voice of strength, a beacon of hope. I had turned my pain into purpose. And in doing so, I had created a new life, a life filled with love, purpose, and endless possibility. As I continued to speak at various events and share my story, I began to notice a shift in the way I viewed myself. I had always seen my journey as something that needed to be hidden away, something that was a mark of weakness. But now, it felt like a badge of honor. My experiences, my pain, and my survival had shaped me into someone strong, someone capable of inspiring others. I wasn't ashamed of what I had gone through. Instead, I wore it proudly, as a symbol of the strength I had gained. I started to see my worth in a new light. I was no longer defined by my past mistakes or the people who had hurt me. I had taken those experiences and used them to fuel my growth. Every step I had taken on my healing journey had brought me closer to the person I was meant to be, and that person was someone who could stand tall even in the face of adversity. I was no longer afraid of my past. I had made peace with it. And in doing so, I had made peace with myself. One evening, as I sat in my office working on my third book, I received an unexpected call from my lawyer. The voice on the other end was calm but professional, and I could sense the gravity of the situation. Chadwick had filed for divorce, finally, after months of back and forth. At first, I felt nothing. No anger, no relief, just a deep sense of indifference. I had let go of any attachment to him long ago, and the news of his divorce filing didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a closing chapter in a book I had already finished reading. The woman I used to be, the one who had clung to the hope of a happy ending with him, no longer existed. The new woman, the woman I had become, didn't need his approval or his love to feel whole. His filing for divorce was a mere formality. It didn't change the fact that I had already moved on, already built a life without him. It didn't matter anymore, and I was free to continue my journey uninterrupted. Days passed, and I found myself smiling more than I ever had before. I had learned to embrace the quiet moments, to savor the peace that came with having no one to answer to but myself. I had spent so many years being controlled by others, trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. But now I was free to make my own choices, free to chase after the things that brought me joy, and free to build a life that was authentically mine. I realized that the life I had always dreamed of wasn't some far-off fantasy. It was something I was living right now. I had created it, piece by piece, through my choices, my actions, and my refusal to let anyone or anything stand in my way. I no longer needed permission to be happy, to be successful, or to be loved. I had learned that love, true love, started with myself. Once I learned to love and accept myself, the rest of the world followed suit. I was no longer waiting for someone to complete me. I had already found completeness within. It was around this time that I started to date again. I had been hesitant at first, unsure if I was ready to open my heart to someone else. But as I continued to grow and heal, I realized that I was capable of love, of giving and receiving it in healthy ways. My first few dates were awkward, filled with moments of uncertainty, but I was proud of myself for putting myself out there. I wasn't looking for a savior, nor was I looking to fill a void. I was simply looking for companionship, for a partner who could match my energy and support my growth. I met a man named Lucas, who had a calmness about him that immediately put me at ease. We shared similar values and interests, and he respected my independence. It was refreshing to meet someone who didn't try to change me or make me feel small. With Lucas, I didn't feel like I had to pretend to be anyone other than who I truly was. He saw me, all of me, and accepted me without question. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to trust again. Lucas was the opposite of everything I had known. Where Chadwick had been controlling and manipulative, Lucas was patient and understanding. He listened to me without judgment, and he supported me in everything I did. He never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with, and he never made me feel like I owed him anything. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, and it was refreshing to experience love in this way. It wasn't about trying to fix each other or complete each other. It was about growing together. With Lucas, I felt like I could continue being my authentic self without fear of being rejected or misunderstood. We didn't rush into anything. Instead, we took our time, enjoying each other's company and learning more about each other every day. As our relationship grew, so did my confidence. I realized that I didn't need to settle for anything less than the best. And with Lucas, I had found someone who brought out the best in me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had found a true partner, someone who stood beside me, not in front of me. Over time, Lucas became an integral part of my life. Our bond deepened as we shared more experiences and built memories together. He encouraged me to continue pursuing my dreams and supported me in ways I never thought possible. I had always been independent, but with Lucas, I realized that it was okay to lean on someone to share the weight of the world every now and then. He wasn't trying to fix me. He was simply there for me when I needed him. It was a partnership, not a one-sided relationship. And as our love grew stronger, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. I had once been a woman trapped in a toxic relationship, unsure of my worth and afraid of standing up for myself. But now I was standing tall, surrounded by people who loved and respected me, and I was in a healthy, supportive relationship. I had built a life that was full of joy, peace, and love, and it was all because I had chosen to fight for my happiness, even when it seemed impossible. Looking back at everything I had endured, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the pain, I couldn't help but feel grateful. It had all led me to this moment, to the person I had become. I was stronger, wiser, and more self-aware than I had ever been. I had learned to trust myself again, to listen to my own instincts, and to never settle for less than I deserved. Chadwick had once been the center of my world, but now he was a distant memory, a lesson in what I would never tolerate again. He had been part of my story, but he was no longer the author of my fate. I was the author of my own story, and it was a story of triumph, resilience, and self-love. I had walked through the fire, and I had come out stronger on the other side. The woman I had become was unstoppable, and I knew that nothing would ever take away the peace and happiness I had worked so hard to find. My future was bright, and I was ready for whatever came next. As time passed, I found that I no longer thought about Chadwick. The occasional memories would surface, but they no longer carried the weight they once did. I had learned to let go of the past, not out of a sense of abandonment, but because I understood that holding on to resentment was only hurting me. He was a chapter in my story, a chapter that had taught me invaluable lessons, but it was a chapter that had ended. I was no longer living in the shadow of what had happened with him. I had finally stepped into my own light. I no longer needed closure from him because I had already given it to myself. I had learned that true closure came from within. It wasn't something that could be handed to me by another person. It was something I created by letting go of the pain, the anger, and the hurt. I had taken control of my narrative, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my peace. I was no longer the victim of my circumstances. I was the heroine of my own story, and I was proud of everything I had overcome to get to this point. I found that the more I focused on my growth, the more I attracted people who were aligned with my values. I no longer sought out relationships based on need or insecurity. Instead, I sought relationships that were built on mutual respect, trust, and shared dreams. I had learned that true connections didn't come from desperation, but from a place of strength and self-awareness. My friendships were deeper now, and I found myself surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being. They didn't want anything from me. They simply wanted to see me succeed, and be happy. In turn, I wanted the same for them. I gave love freely, not because I needed it, but because I had an abundance of it to give. My life had become a reflection of the inner peace I had cultivated. And as I continued to nurture the relationships that mattered most, I realized that love was no longer something I had to chase. It was something that found me naturally, effortlessly, as a result of the person I had become. I was no longer trying to fill a void. I had become whole. The day I made the decision to sell the house I had shared with Chadwick was symbolic. It wasn't just about moving on from a physical space. It was about shedding the last remnants of my old life. Every room in that house had held memories of our time together, the good, the bad, and everything in between. But none of those memories held power over me anymore. I was ready to create new memories, to step into a new chapter of my life. The house had once been a symbol of what I had hoped would be my future, with Chadwick, but now it represented nothing but the past, a past I was ready to leave behind. The process of selling the house was cathartic. It was as if I was releasing the final ties that had bound me to a life I no longer wanted. As I packed up the last of my belongings, I felt a sense of liberation. The woman who had once felt trapped by her circumstances was now free. Free to start over, free to rebuild, and free to live a life that was truly hers. It didn't take long before I found a new place to live, a small apartment that was perfect for me. It was cozy, peaceful, and filled with light. As I walked through the door for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. This space was mine. I had chosen it for me, and it reflected who I was becoming, a woman who was strong, independent, and unapologetically herself. The apartment was a fresh start, a place where I could fully embrace my new life. I decorated it with things that made me feel happy and at peace, artwork that inspired me, books that fueled my creativity, and plants that brought life to every room. It wasn't much, but it was perfect for me. I realized that I didn't need a large house or extravagant possessions to feel fulfilled. All I needed was a space that reflected my values, my growth, and my aspirations. And as I sat in my new apartment, I realized that I had everything I needed to create a life of happiness. I didn't need anyone to complete me. I was already whole. The more I spent time in my new apartment, the more I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been lost during the years with Chadwick. I had always loved painting, but somewhere along the way, I had stopped picking up my brushes. Now, I found myself pulling out old canvases, mixing colors, and allowing my emotions to flow through my art. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I could finally express myself without fear of judgment. My paintings were no longer just about technique or skill. They were about my healing, my journey, and my growth. Each stroke of the brush was a release, a way for me to let go of the pain and embrace the beauty that had come from the struggle. I found solace in the act of creation, and for the first time in years, I felt truly connected to myself. Painting became a form of therapy, a way for me to process my emotions and channel them into something positive. As I looked at my completed pieces, I couldn't help but smile. I was proud of what I had created, both on the canvas and in my life. In the months that followed, I began to share my artwork with others. At first, it was just friends and family, but soon, my paintings started to get noticed by people outside my circle. I was invited to showcase my work at local art galleries, and I began to receive commissions for custom pieces. It was surreal to see my art being appreciated by others. What started as a personal form of expression had evolved into a source of income and recognition. But more than that, it was a reminder of how far I had come. My art had always been a reflection of my inner world, and now it was a reflection of my strength, my resilience, and my journey to freedom. I no longer saw myself as the woman who had been broken by her past. I saw myself as the woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up piece by piece, just like the art I created. Every brushstroke was a testament to my healing, and every canvas was a reminder that I had the power to create the life I wanted. By now, I had come to realize that the life I was living wasn't just the result of my choices. It was the result of my willingness to let go of what no longer served me. I had learned to release the fear, the anger, and the resentment that had once held me back. I had let go of Chadwick and the toxic hold he had on me, but I had also let go of the parts of myself that had allowed me to stay in that situation for so long. I had released the belief that I needed someone else to validate my worth. I had learned to find validation within myself, and as I looked around at the life I had built, at my art, my new relationships, and the peace I had cultivated, I realized that I had found the freedom I had always craved. The life I was living was my own creation, and it was everything I had dreamed of and more. I was no longer a prisoner of my past. I was free, and I was finally living life on my own terms. The final piece of my healing came when I found out that Chadwick had remarried. At first, there was a moment of curiosity, a brief glance into his life to see if he had truly changed. But then, I realized it didn't matter. His life was his to live, and mine was mine to live. I had no interest in the man who had once held so much power over me. I had let go of the idea that I needed to know how his life turned out. My peace was no longer tied to his decisions. His remarriage was simply a reminder that the past was gone, and that chapter of my life had closed for good. In fact, I felt no animosity toward him at all. The person I had been, the one who had been hurt by his betrayal, was gone. In her place was a woman who had found strength in her own journey, and who no longer needed the validation of others. I had learned to find my own worth, and that was something no one, not even Chadwick, could take away from me. As I sat in my favorite cafe one afternoon, reflecting on all that had transpired in my life, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I had learned, for the strength I had gained, and for the incredible people who had supported me along the way. I thought about the friendships I had built, the art I had created, and the love I had finally found for myself. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving. My life had become a testament to the power of transformation. I had walked through the fire and emerged stronger, wiser, and more whole than I had ever been before. The woman who had once been afraid of her own power had now embraced it. I no longer needed anyone to save me, because I had saved myself. And as I looked toward the future, I realized that there were no limits to what I could accomplish. My journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. The next chapter of my life would be even more beautiful than the last, because it was one I was creating from a place of strength, peace, and love. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Chadwick. My heart raced as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was brief, but it was enough to stir something deep inside me. He was apologizing. He apologized for everything, the lies, the manipulation, the pain he had caused. And in that moment, I realized something. I didn't need his apology to heal. I had already forgiven him, not for his sake, but for mine. Holding onto the anger and resentment only kept me tethered to the past, and I had worked so hard to let go of that. His apology was a reminder of how far I had come, of how much I had grown. I wasn't the same woman who had been trapped in that toxic relationship. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, and nothing, not even his words, could take that away from me. I didn't need his forgiveness. I had already forgiven myself, and that was all that truly mattered. In the months that followed, I found myself becoming more involved in my community. I started volunteering at local organizations, using my story to help others who were going through similar struggles. My past had not been easy, but it had given me a unique perspective on the importance of resilience and self-love. I had learned that no matter how dark things may seem, there was always a way to find the light. I wanted to share that message with others. I knew that the pain I had experienced wasn't in vain. It had given me the strength to rise above it and to help others do the same. As I spent more time giving back, I realized how much fulfillment it brought me. Helping others on their own journeys of healing and empowerment gave my life a deeper sense of purpose. It wasn't just about my own growth anymore. It was about lifting others up and being a part of their transformation as well. And in doing so, I found a new sense of joy. I had gone from a woman who had been broken to a woman who was helping to heal others, and that felt incredibly rewarding. I was walking through a park one day when I saw a young woman sitting on a bench, her face drawn with sadness. Something in me knew she was in pain, and I felt compelled to approach her. I sat beside her and introduced myself. At first, she was hesitant to speak, but after a few minutes, she opened up. She shared how she had been in an abusive relationship, how she had lost herself in the process, and how she didn't know how to move forward. I listened intently, offering her words of encouragement, but I also shared my own story, how I had been in her shoes once and had managed to find my way out. I explained that healing wasn't a straight path, that there would be good days and bad days, but that she had the strength to get through it. As I spoke, I saw a spark of hope in her eyes. I told her that she was not alone, that there were people who cared, and that she could rebuild her life just as I had. When I left that day, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I had made a difference in someone's life. The more I connected with others who had experienced similar pain, the more I realized that there was a deeper purpose in my journey. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about helping others thrive, too. I had gone through the darkness, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had emerged from it stronger than I ever imagined, and now it was my turn to be a beacon of light for others. Every conversation, every piece of advice, every moment of encouragement I gave was a step toward healing, not just for them, but for me as well. I had never expected my story to resonate with so many people, but the more I shared it, the more I saw how universal the struggle for self-worth and freedom truly was. I had found my calling in helping others heal, and I was determined to continue this work for as long as I could. I was no longer the victim of my circumstances. I was a survivor, a healer, and a guide for those who were still lost in the darkness. Looking back at everything I had overcome, I realized that I had transformed my pain into power. My past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I was no longer the woman who had been trapped by fear and self-doubt. I was the woman who had taken control of her own life, who had chosen to rise above the circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. I was a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. And as I continued on my journey, I knew that nothing could stop me now. I was unstoppable. The woman I had become was strong, confident, and unapologetic. I had learned to love myself, to trust myself, and to never settle for anything less than what I deserved. The future was wide open, and I was ready to embrace it with open arms. My past had prepared me for this moment, and now I was stepping into the life I had always dreamed of, a life of freedom, joy, and love. I was finally free, and it was the most beautiful feeling in the world.